Hello and welcome to another episode of All Politics is Local. I'm John Tian. All Politics is Local is a production of the Greater Blackstone Valley Democrats. For more information about the Greater Blackstone Valley Dems, feel free to visit our website at www.gbvdems.org. We have yet another great show planned for you tonight. With me in the studio is Bryan from he's a spokesman for the Citizens for Responsible Cannabis Retail Sales here in Milford. All Politics being local, there's a referendum coming up on September the 19th. And Bryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time.
These chairs are far apart.
Tell me, what is it all about here with the Citizens for Responsible Cannabis Retail Sales?
It's a mouthful, isn't it?
It sure is.
Well, you know, we've gone around and we've done some sort of canvassing to just sort of alert people to the issue at hand, and we get the same response time and time again. There's a referendum? Didn't we just vote on this? Mm-hmm. But the thing is that written into the statewide referendum was the ability for towns to opt in and out. And so the Board of Selectmen basically instantaneously scheduled a referendum for the middle of the fall when nobody expects anything to decide whether or not the town wanted to opt out. And we at the Citizens for Responsible Cannabis Retail Sales feel that rather than opting out, it would be better for the town of Milford to have marijuana regulated the way alcohol is now.
And isn't that pretty much what the referendum called for in the first place?
Well, actually, more or less. And again, the town did vote for the referendum. And since the referendum was passed, there's actually been additional legislation that's gone through the State House, been signed by Governor Baker, that has actually increased the threshold and made it made life a little more, given additional responsibilities basically on marijuana resellers.
Okay, on retail establishments.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Which we're all in favor of. We are in favor of responsible retail sales. It's right in the name. And we feel that regulating it like a business would allow the town to better control the distribution, to better control the quality, better control the potency, better control who it's sold to, than just throwing your hands up and saying and letting the black market or whoever else, continue to operate.
So essentially, it's not really a question of whether or not there will be marijuana in town.
No,
there is marijuana in town.
And even the group that is pushing for a yes vote on the referendum, because got to keep in mind, yes means no on this, right? A yes vote is for the ban, and a no vote is against the ban and to continue allowing retail sales as the town originally voted for. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. What was the original question?
We were talking about how it's not a question of whether or not there will be marijuana in town. There already is marijuana in town.
Of course.
Yes.
Aside from the long and storied history of people in the state of Massachusetts smoking marijuana, which goes back decades, centuries, right? Even the yes group on this will admit this is not designed to affect medical marijuana, and this is not designed to affect the ability of people to consume it under the law. This is not even going to affect people's personal growth or personal use exemption. Remember that you're allowed, I believe it's 12 plants that you can grow in your backyard if you're so inclined. But this referendum will not affect any of that. So people will still have access to marijuana. They will still continue to smoke marijuana, and they will still continue to do whatever else with it. All this will affect, essentially, is whether or not the town will derive any sort of benefit from it, right? Will the town see new businesses? Will the town see, for lack of a better word, auxiliary businesses, people like Sage and Pro Verde, who are not selling marijuana as such, but are selling services related to it? Pro Verde, for those who don't know, they are a sort of testing facility in town. You bring them a sample, and they will test the potency, they will test the strain and the quality and all those sort of things. And so those sort of businesses will thrive under this, now that this referendum has passed, now that the statewide referendum has passed.
Mm-hmm.
But, and they're, they're threatened by this sort of chilling effect that banning it in town would have.
And really banning it in town would, at the end of the day, it doesn't remove marijuana from our town.
No, of course not.
There is a thriving black market in marijuana, and there has been for years, like you say, decades.
Sure.
Certainly since the days of reefer madness, when it was first made illegal because the attorney general at the time needed to make something illegal. He wanted something to justify an increased budget for his department.
Well, everyone's got to have a hobby.
I guess.
Right. Yeah, and the thing is that we've actually seen studies that show that the black market is not necessarily eliminated, but let's say mitigated in states, in towns that legalize recreational marijuana. Adult use cannabis, as they keep trying to get me to say.
Okay. So the bill that's come out of the State House now
Yes.
varies widely from the bill that was approved by the voters in November 2016. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think the bill is interesting. The bill that's come out of the State House is interesting in the number of sort of improvements that have been made to assuage the fears of people after the initial referendum passed. I remember Representative Murray, or now State Rep Murray, back when he was at a candidate forum in the fall, saying that he was for recreational marijuana in general, but not for the version of it in the bill and in the referendum. And what has come out since then has made things has cleaned it up a lot. You see there are limits to advertising. You cannot advertise for marijuana to audiences that are less than 85% 21 or over. So basically, you have to you restrict the advertising to minors. Edibles, which is a scare tactic that's gone around. People are concerned that children will confuse edible marijuana products, gummies and the like, with normal
candies.
Yes.
Yep.
Well, written into the law that's come out of the State House, you cannot make edible products that look like existing foods. So you will not end up with the marijuana gummy that looks like a Swedish fish, say.
Okay.
All right?
Yep.
The packaging has to be opaque. The tax rate has increased.
Right. Wasn't the tax rate in the referendum like 12%? I think
believe
it's gone
it
up to 20.
was. I think that's right.
Yeah.
In there, by the way, is a 3% local. It's an up to 3%, 3% local tax that's gone on top of that. So Franklin, for instance, when they passed their zoning laws that allowed retail marijuana sales in town, they added a 2% local tax on top of what they thought was 12%. Well, that's included in this legislation.
Okay.
So
There's
everybody
the ability
can do that
for the
now.
local tax.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So that, and again, I don't want to make this just about the money, because I believe and we believe that this is more than just the dollars and cents things, but we cannot deny that there is money that we're leaving on the table if we ban retail marijuana sales.
So now there is a 20% tax that's payable to the state, and there can be a local tax on top of that as well.
I believe that's part of the 20%. I forget what the exact breakdown is,
Okay.
But of that, 3% is for local.
But be that as it may,
3 percentage points, I
the
suppose.
lion's share of the tax will go to the state to then be redistributed to the towns? Do we know where that money's going?
Well, I believe it will be redistributed to towns, and it will also be used for public health purposes to study the effect of marijuana sales, to limit for addiction programs and things like that. And it's important to keep that in mind too. And this is another point, because if you're concerned about addiction, and I'm not going to deny that marijuana can be addicting, because it can, but that shouldn't stop us, because we sell, alcohol is addicting, Tobacco is addicting.
Sure.
Gambling is addicting. I can walk 5 minutes from my house to the Purchase Street Market and get all three in one stop.
Well, and sure, they talk about the thousands of opioid deaths lately, but look at the number of deaths from cigarettes.
Sure.
Hundreds of thousands of
Right,
deaths
and
from cigarettes.
alcohol kills 30,000 people a year, and we're not having that discussion. And we shouldn't have that discussion, frankly. I don't want to have that discussion again. But the point is that having legal sellers of these products, whether it's gambling or whether it's alcohol or whatever it is, they are more likely to contribute to battling addiction, to making sure people use their product responsibly,
Right.
than an underground market or a black market type situation.
Sure,
Right?
absolutely, yes. Yeah.
And at its simplest, who is more likely to contribute to fund addiction treatment? A pharmaceutical company that sells opioid painkillers or a heroin dealer. And it's the same thing here. If you have legal sellers, if you have businesses, they are incentivized to take it seriously and to think about the public health ramifications.
Sure, and that's just really simple capitalism, too,
Absolutely.
at the end of the day.
And listen, you talked about the Greater Blackstone Valley Democrats at the beginning of the show, and I don't want to put this out as if it's a liberal position. Some of our best members are libertarians. But the point is, no, I mean, in all seriousness, this is not a left versus right issue.
Sure.
This is about, do we want to regulate this? Do we want to control it? Or do we just want to
have the
hope for the
free-for-all
best?
to have the free-for-all that we currently have. I mean, if somebody wants to give me $100, I can go get some marijuana right now in town, virtually anywhere. I can go to a bar and just ask, and I'll get some. That's how easy it is, and the black market is out there. It's out there for everybody to use.
Absolutely.
I look at this as a matter of if you're concerned about children having access to marijuana, you should
Absolutely.
license it, legalize it, and regulate it.
Sure.
Children can get marijuana much more easily than they can get a six-pack of beer.
Of course. And we've seen in municipalities and states where recreational marijuana is legal, teenage use has dropped. Why? It's like you said, it's more difficult for them to get access to it. And again, let's go by an analogy. Who has a stronger incentive to keep it out of the hands of minors? Is it the legal seller, right? The dispensary who has a license and a reputation to uphold,
and an opportunity to lose that license
absolutely,
if they sell to someone too
they
young.
are strongly incentivized to uphold and follow the existing laws to the letter. Whereas if you don't have that in town, the black market will continue to operate, continue to thrive, and you will see, it's going to be a guy taking advantage of his 12 plants to sell it to the high schoolers or whatever.
Right, but if someone were to do that, if I were to grow 12 plants and start selling to teenagers, I would be in danger of being prosecuted under the law. I can't do that. That's still against the law for me to do it. I don't have a license to sell.
That's true, but that's much smaller. Right? I mean, that's going to be very difficult for people to police, unless the free market sort of takes care of that. If we have legal sellers in town, there will not be the incentive. There will not be as great an incentive for, people for a black market
to develop.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It will make it more difficult.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about safety. There are some concerns about safety, and should we need additional public safety officers as a result of allowing marijuana shops in town?
Yeah. I mean, do you have any evidence that that's the case?
I do not, but that's an argument that I've heard in favor of banning marijuana shops in town.
Well, look, I try to be a reasonable person, and I would like to see some evidence that that's actually the case, be that as it may. I think it's also worth pointing out that no matter what, marijuana, first of all, legalizing marijuana is going to change how the police interact. You've also heard about DUIs, the potential for an increase in DUIs if marijuana is legalized. But did you know, going back to alcohol for a second, the DUI rate in dry counties is more than 3 times, I think it's 3.5 times what it is in so-called wet counties.
Really?
Oh, yes.
Because people can't get the alcohol in the dry county, so they
and
drive.
they go drive off, and then they go drive back.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I went to school in Louisiana, and there's a county, believe it's between West Baton Rouge and East Baton Rouge. And one has a closing time at 1 a.m. and one has a closing time at 2 a.m. So what everybody does is they will get in their cars from the bars at 1 a.m., drive over a bridge to drink for an extra hour, except there are a lot of alcohol-related fatalities at the bottom of that bridge.
Sure.
Because people are trying to circumvent the law.
Yep.
And that's the same thing you'd see in town. You'd see that same sort of, if you are concerned about safety, you want people traveling as little as possible to try and consume it. And I do believe, by the way, and we have seen, and it is true, that there's not necessarily a good test for driving under the influence of marijuana as such right now. But the funding that we are getting from the state, the funding that the state will derive from retail sales, will be used to support research into just that sort of public health issue. Undoubtedly will be used in that way.
To develop a test that can
Right.
tell in real time.
Yes.
Because one of the issues with marijuana testing is that it stays in your system. It's stored in fat
Sure.
cells and stays in your system for weeks
Yes.
at a time. And so what you're saying is that there should be some way to develop a test in
Sure,
real
the
time that
governor's-
tells, is this person under the influence?
I believe that's a reasonable assumption to make. Look, the governor's council that they have come up with, the cannabis something, there's 3 C's. It's the CCC. I forget what it stands for. But they are interested not only in ensuring that the product out there is of high quality and a consistent quality and clean.
And safe.
Yes,
Yep,
thank you,
safe
and
clean.
safe.
Yep.
But they're also concerned about the ramifications on communities, as they should be, and as we are, as this group is. But again, we've talked a little bit about this. This is a tricky thing because you see a lot of these arguments, and they basically boil down to, should we have marijuana or not? And that's not what this is about, right? This is not about should marijuana be legal, because it is legal. The people of this Commonwealth and this town voted for it. What we're asking now is, should we control it or should we not? That's what it comes down to. That's what the referendum is all about.
Okay, so another thing that people would say on a public safety aspect
Sure.
of things is that marijuana shops cannot deal with federally chartered banks
Yes.
because it's still against the federal law. Possession of marijuana is still against federal law. So in that instance, what they're postulating is that there would be a higher security risk around marijuana shops, risk of break-ins, risk because it's a cash business. There'd be more risk of robbery.
Right. I think that was what you were getting at last time, and I sort of danced around that. So let me address it now. Thank you. The thing is that the businesses associated with this know these things already. This is no different than what happens with medical marijuana. I don't know if you were there when Sage presented their plan to open up a medical dispensary in the Kohl's parking lot, somewhere in that plaza over on 109.
I was not there. So,
Okay.
So
But
by all
believe me
means.
when I tell you, I mean, I wasn't there either, but from what I'm told, the security arrangements were impressive,
Okay.
right? These guys know the risk. They are aware of the sort of that perception. They have plans in place to deal with it. And if you drive by Sage's facility where they grow marijuana in town, on Bear Hill somewhere, it's quite the fortress. They will take down your license plate as you drive past.
Wow.
Just in case. Absolutely. Look, eventually we as a country are going to have a conversation about do we want these banking laws to stay the same? Will it be to legalize it for banks to sort of rationalize it, right?
Well,
because this isn't
not only that, Cory Booker has introduced a bill into the Senate to legalize marijuana.
Yeah, I'm not going to hold my breath.
Yeah, me either.
Right. But
at least it's there. That's a
sure,
step
no,
forward.
the conversation is absolutely changing, and the stigma around marijuana is lessening, and we are starting to have a conversation that is based less on reefer madness. I point to you as if you were involved. Less on reefer madness, and more on facts, and more on the evidence. Sure. And the evidence shows, by the way, and we've seen this in place after place, is that the fear of robberies is overblown, frankly. And so I don't think that is a until I see evidence otherwise, I don't know that that is a real concern.
There ought to be evidence that could be collected. I mean, Colorado has legalized marijuana.
Sure, and
Washington
that's the
State.
other thing. I've heard people say that it's too soon to do this. We don't want to be pioneers in this town. Well, that's insane to me. That's too much, because we're not pioneers. We're following the crowd at this point.
Sure.
Nevada's already legalized it and is selling it, and Washington State has legalized it, and Colorado has been selling it for years, and Maine, I believe, is about to start selling it. Not to mention countries like the Netherlands and Scandinavia, where it is legal, and,
Sure.
and Uruguay.
Yeah.
So we are not that unique. We do not have that unique a situation. We can take the best and worst from other places and learn from these things. You know, we're not doing this in a vacuum. And you know, as I said at the beginning, marijuana is not new.
Right.
We know what marijuana does. We know how it affects people.
Well, people have been actually using it as a medicine.
Of course.
For centuries.
Yes.
For millennia, really. That's one of the reasons why there are cannabinoid receptors in our brains, is
Sure.
because people were using it.
Yes.
You know, those evolved over time.
Well, I would argue that probably it was the other way around. The receptors evolved first, and then we discovered that we can use it. But that's not the point. And again, it's a tricky issue, this referendum, because it's very easy to get off the track. We can discuss the benefits of medical marijuana until we're blue in the face, but it doesn't matter.
Right. This
We're not
isn't
voting
about
on that.
medical marijuana.
No,
Right.
that's not what it's about.
Right. So
It's
this
about, do
referendum
we-
really, to get back to the point, it's really just about will we
I'm sorry
get
if
the
it makes it.
benefit?
I'm sorry if it makes it a you know, somewhat of a boring show for me to keep saying, but that's not what it's about. It's about controlling it. But it's true. It's what it's about. It's not, you know. And if you talk to the other group, they will say this will not affect medical marijuana use. This will not affect the personal use exemption, and this will not affect you know, your ability to actually use adult use cannabis yourself. All it will affect is the ability of the town of Milford to derive any sort of benefit from it. So, I mean, keep that in mind when we're talking about this, because that's really, again, that's what it comes down to.
Okay. So not to lose track of where you're at with this, but
Please.
let's talk a little bit about some of the other arguments against marijuana.
Sure.
Is marijuana really a gateway drug? A lot of people will tell you that it's a gateway drug and that we should keep it out of the hands of our populace.
Sure, and I've seen scientific articles that have tried to make I'm sorry, that wasn't a scientific article, that was an op-ed, that tried to make the point that alcohol and marijuana were used commonly by heroin addicts before they moved on to heroin. Notice I said alcohol and marijuana, again. But that's fine, we'll put that aside for a second and point out that, according to some studies, about half the country has tried marijuana in some form or another. About 13% of town, so that's, 13% of Americans have used marijuana or continue to use marijuana habitually. And again, regardless of the legal status of the drug. What you don't necessarily see are thousands or hundreds of thousands of addicts directly as a result of this. You know, just because something happens before does not necessarily.
Right.
Caffeine also is a common thing that I'm sure was used before.
Sure.
Not to be too flip about it, but I think, you know, we don't necessarily see studies that show that marijuana and marijuana alone, right? We've seen, you know, the sort of common approach there is to look at it backwards and say we take, not to get too statisticky, but let's get statisticky for a second. We take heroin users and we see what percentage of them used alcohol or marijuana, but that's not the right question. The question is what percentage of marijuana users or alcohol users
Progressed.
Yes, exactly.
To heroin.
And there the evidence just isn't there.
Sure, and if as you say, 50% of America has tried marijuana,
Right.
That's 165 million, 170 million people. Are we seeing 170 million heroin addicts on
No.
our streets?
Right, of course.
Yeah. So again, that really
And again,
doesn't-
we might have brought this up before, it's hard to remember, but you do actually see lower incidence of opioid use, of opioid addiction and deaths in communities that have legalized marijuana. You also see reduced alcohol use. You see reduced antidepressant use, which I was surprised at personally. But it's amazing the sort of knock-on effects you get from legalization and sort of normalization of it.
And there's actually never been a cannabis overdose resulting in death.
No, that's the other thing. You know, you said however many millions of deaths were attributable to smoking. Last year in the United States, 30,000 deaths were attributable to alcohol. Last year there was, 146 deaths in Worcester County from opioids. To my knowledge, in the history of the CDC database,
0.
none. And the reason for that is the amount of THC that is required for you to feel the effects of it, the amount to get stoned, frankly, is orders of magnitude. I believe it's 1,000 times less than the LD50, the fatal dose. And so you can feel the effects of the drug without running into that, without coming anywhere close to that ceiling.
And that's a very, very high ceiling.
Absolutely.
You'd basically fall asleep well before reaching that.
Sure.
There'd be no way for you to remain conscious.
Right. And again, it's important to note, this is not because it has been underground since marijuana has been legalized in some of these other states. We continue to see 0 deaths from overdose.
There you go. So let's talk a little bit about licensing too. Would there be a pot shop in every corner if the town were to allow marijuana
And a
shops
chicken in
town?
every pot shop.
A chicken in every pot shop.
No. Look, that's one of the other things that was in the state referendum. Not the state referendum. The law that came out of the State House recently was that the number of pot shops, I'll just call them pot shops, that are allowed in town is tied to the number of liquor stores you have. So you cannot, above and beyond the sort of free market argument that you couldn't put a pot shop on every corner in town and keep it in business because there's just not that many people.
Right, capitalism doesn't generally work that way.
No.
Right.
I just, we've been saying this over and over again, and I just want to say it one more time, is that it's not about do we want marijuana in town or not. Marijuana has been in town. Marijuana will continue to be in town. Marijuana will be legal in town. It's just a question of, do we want the town of Milford to control it, to regulate it, to benefit from it, frankly? Or do we not? And if you want to regulate marijuana, to have the same sort of controls that you have on marijuana that currently exist for things like alcohol, then we are urging people to vote no on Tuesday, September 19th. Against the ban, at least unless they really change the wording of the referendum, which I would be surprised at. In the meantime, if you want to get involved, we have a Facebook page. We are at facebook.com/MilfordCann, C-A-N-N with 2 N's. And once again, just ask people to vote no on September 19th.
Okay, Bryan, thank you so much for being here tonight. Really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, John.
All right, you're welcome. Take care.
Thank you.
So you've been watching All Politics is Local. All Politics is Local is a production of the Greater Blackstone Valley Democrats. For more information about the Greater Blackstone Valley Dems, feel free to visit our website at www.gbvdems.org. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Good night.
Wait, hang on a second. Do I get a closing?